Okay, we are now on chapter 3 in Thomas Pynchon's novel V. And chapter 3 is a long chapter, and it's the first story that we get about V, which is set in Egypt, at Alexandria and Cairo in 1898 during the Fasciota Crisis, which is further down south. The Nile is one of the few rivers in the world that flows from south to north, so Upper Egypt is in the south, Lower Egypt is in the north, but the narrative moves from Alexandria to Cairo. So we have the Fasciota Crisis, and this is, of course, a reworking of a story that Thomas Pynchon wrote a year or two before called Under the Rose, which is a longish story. A lot of the imagery is clearly inspired by Alfred Hitchcock's 1950s movie, his remake of The Man Who Knew Too Much with Jimmy Stewart, which is set in Egypt also, I believe. Especially the opera scene at the end with the assassination attempt that then is borrowed by Francis Ford Coppola for the climax of Godfather Part 3. That's taken from Hitchcock's remake of his own film, The Man Who Knew Too Much, and then so is the opera assassination attempt that takes place at the end of this chapter. Also has come, I believe, from The Man Who Knew Too Much. At least a lot of the imagery does. So the background to this is that so we have Napoleon had entered into Egypt. So the French first enter into Egypt with him, 1798 to 1801. And then when they leave, there's a power vacuum for a couple of years. And then an Ottoman ruler comes back in and retakes it, named Muhammad Ali. And he retakes control over Egypt. And then except for Sudan. And Sudan always is an issue here between all of these competing powers. But he does take it in 1824. Conquer Egypt, conquer Sudan, 1824. Now the British are they start building their empire. In 1882, when they attack Alexandria, they start shelling it from the water. There are disturbances. They put down the disturbances, and then they end up taking over Egypt. And they have, so they've taken over Egypt. There's still the issue of Sudan, especially because it's a thorn in the side of the British because it's blocking them from forming a complete north to south empire, imperialist, colonialist axis from Alexandria to Cape Town, which is what Cecil Rhodes wanted to do. He wanted to build a transcontinental railway from Cairo to Cape Town that would create a smooth colonialist British empire from north to south. But that didn't happen because the issue of Sudan is always blocking that. And then they have to deal with the Mahdi, who comes in and takes from Sudan and comes in and takes Khartoum, starting in 1881, in 1883. Then he dies. Then there's the issue that the French now and the British have to work out in 1885 between how they're going to divide up their empires here. The French now, by 1885, have colonies in the north, which will eventually become French North Africa, in the west, in West Africa, in Senegal, and in French Congo, and then just this one little spot in East Africa, Djibouti. So what's going on here is that we have two empires. What the French want to do is to connect Senegal at the western end of Africa with Djibouti, going exactly west-east to create routes that will connect them. But that, of course, conflicts with the British interests in creating a north-south imperial axis from Alexandria to Cape Town. And the two cross right at Fasciota. So that's the backdrop here. And it was thought now, when this was going on, that it might spark a major war then between Britain and France. And everyone in Europe pretty much assumed that it was going to happen. And the whole point of this in connecting V, in her first manifestation here, as an 18-year-old beautiful girl named Victoria Wren. Wren is also W-R-E-N, the bird goddess. The bird is also a very ancient association with the goddess, as the dove is, let's say, with Aphrodite. So she's always connected with these apocalyptic or near-apocalyptic scenarios because she is, and this is the earliest chronologically of her stories. It's the first of the stories, but also the earliest chronologically. And so Herbert Stencil is putting all of this together because Pynchon has to figure out a problem here, which is how to take his story now, which initially had nothing to do with a novel called V, and then rework it into this chapter to put it in the context of the V story. And the way in which he does this is that he has Herbert Stencil, whom we met at the party last time, the son of the spy Sidney Stencil, who knew some of these characters, some of these spies, as we'll see. There are 4 of them. And so the whole problem then is to rework it, and he has Herbert Stencil, he says, the subtitle is Chapter 3, in which Stencil, a quick change artist, does 8 impersonations. So Pynchon's original version of the story had been told in objective third person, but now what he does is he breaks it up into 8 subsections, each of which is told from the point of view of a different person, all of whom are workers in what we today would call the service industry, waitresses, train conductors, all peripheral people who are marginalized here, who just overhear things, overhear snatches of conversation. And so the pretense is that Stencil is writing this out. It's as though he's a quick change artist doing these impersonations, pretending that he's each one of these individuals and imagining what they must have seen. So that's the conceit of the chapter, and its historical setting. So then, and we're in 1898 when it's set. Now, there's a reference here in the first paragraph to a couple of books, The Golden Bough and The White Goddess. We should also pay attention to the first line. As spread thighs are to the libertine, and the libertine here is going to be one of these spies called Goodfellow, who deflowers Victoria Wren, seduces her and deflowers her. Under the Rose was the initial title. The rose is sacred to Venus, and it's also a vaginal symbol, of course. Flights of migratory birds to the ornithologist, the working part of his tool bit to the production machinist. So was the letter V to young Stencil. And then he says that he would dream perhaps once a week that it had all been a dream, and that now he'd awakened to discover the pursuit of V was merely a scholarly quest after all. An adventure of the mind in the tradition of the Golden Bough or the White Goddess. And so it sounds vaguely dismissive, but it isn't. These books, The Golden Bough was published by Sir James Fraser in between, I think it was 12 volumes, between 1890 and 1904-ish, or maybe all the way down to 1915. It was a long undertaking, and it completely revolutionized the field of myth studies as Fraser tracked the transformations of mythology around the world from the 3 stages that he called the magical phase, then to the phase of religion, then to the phase of science, which he believed would completely outmode the earlier phases once and for all. So it's a grand meta-narrative. And Stencil is the sort of incarnation of modernism, and he is interested in grand meta-narratives. And then with Robert Graves, we have, with his novel The White Goddess, we have this idea of his that he tracks the goddess as something that patriarchy has overthrown. These books, especially The White Goddess, would not have even been possible without J.J. Bachman first, who wrote Mother Right in the 1860s. That's only been partially translated into English. That was the first of these studies to do this. I think Graves' book was 1946, if I remember right. It's very long. And it is an adventure of the mind in which he tracks the goddess and what patriarchy has done to her in creating a scientific world order and in eliminating mystery and paradox from the world. And so there are those 2 books. And then there's a third book that's very important, which is The Education of Henry Adams, which is referred to on the next page, that has a huge influence on V. And in The Education of Henry Adams, he contrasts the Virgin, and it's a famous contrast, the Virgin and the Dynamo. And he says basically what the Virgin did in the medieval period, and of course many of those cathedrals, Our Mother, Notre Dame, which is now burned down, so an age has ended here, were manifestations of the generative power of the goddess. Here, the Virgin, of her transformation as a virgin goddess, and the creative power of bringing Western civilization, Northwestern civilization, into being, with all these cathedrals and the Madonna cults of around the year 1200 and so forth. We saw in the last chapter monks inventing the mechanical clock. This was a very creative age. And then Henry Adams lamenting that in the 19th century, the dynamo, the electric dynamo, the thing which generates electricity, these huge machines, is replacing her in power as the motive force of Western civilization now. And this is a degeneration. Adam saw it as a degeneration, replacing the Virgin as the creatrix, the muse of the West. And so he sets up this sort of bivalent metaphysical opposition that then Pynchon comes along and in a sense deconstructs, but what he does is he fuses them together by taking the goddess, V, and tracking her descent into the machine so that the two becomes fused, and mechanical parts slowly become parts of her actual physical body. In doing this, though, I'm quite convinced that he saw Fritz Lang's Metropolis with its image of the famous mechanical goddess, her name being Maria. So it's a transformation of the name of Mary into Maria the robot. And in that film, when we first see her, there's a doorway. It's been a long time since I've seen it, but as I recall, there's a doorway with a Roman numeral 5 above it, a V. And then she's seated in this room, which is a laboratory that James Whale borrowed all sorts of imagery from for his version of the 1930s version of Frankenstein, in which the robot, the female robot, is sitting on a chair above a giant pentagram. And the lower leg of which is 5, of course, there are 5 points in a pentagram, and the lower leg of it hangs above her head in the shape of a V, as then the mad scientist there proceeds to animate her by transplanting a woman's sort of soul into her. So that's basically the bridge that Pynchon uses, that image, the connection with V and the number 5, to fuse together the Virgin and the Dynamo and to chronicle this descent of the muse of Western civilization into the atrocities. The presiding muse now, we have the 9 muses who all preside over, different kinds of, Cleo presides over history, and Calliope over lyric poetry, I believe. Each one presides over a different sphere of the arts, but Pynchon's V now is the muse of chaos, catastrophe, and apocalypse. She presides over nothing but destruction. And so the Fasciota Crisis here is the beginnings of what will kick off eventually into World War I. This is the first sort of real imperialist tensions. Germany gets in on the act here too by taking over Tanganyika in East Africa and helping to block the North-South formation of Great Britain, England forming its North to South empire. So there are 4 spies here. One of them is German. Lepsius is his name. So he's a German spy. And then we have these 3 other spies. We have 2 who constitute almost a kind of comic Laurel and Hardy pair, Porpentine and Goodfellow. Goodfellow is described as fat, and then Porpentine is always described as he got a sunburn on his face. But these are important devices for you to identify through these other people's, the service industry workers, so that you know who they're looking at if they don't know the names. So they're sort of companions. They both want Victoria Wren. Goodfellow, of course, gets her. Porpentine doesn't. And they are opposed by the German spy Lepsius and another guy named Bongo Shaftesbury. And Bongo Shaftesbury will end up at the end of the chapter killing Porpentine. The 2 of them have a particular hatred for each other. And so it's unclear to me, unless it must be Bongo Shaftesbury who is working for the French government. It has to be Bongo Shaftesbury, despite the name, working for the French as a spy for them. But he is also associated with Lepsius. But in any event, there's this quartet of spies, and the 2 of them who want Victoria Wren, who's an 18-year-old beautiful woman, and her father, Sir Alistair Wren, is there. We meet him as well, and then her 11-year-old sister Mildred, who's a rock collector, which is the first association with the inanimate, the mineralogical realm of the Wren family. And so then the impersonations begin with the first one, where Stencil pretends that he is a waiter named Ayul. I believe he's an Arabic waiter out at some place called the Place Muhammad Ali, and it's a cafe, and Goodfellow is sitting at a table, and then he sees Porpentine come running up, and the 2 of them meet. They sit down for coffee, and Ayul has all these negative, shitty thoughts about how ridiculous their names sound and these British idiots. Whereas in the original story, Ayul isn't there, and it's told in 3rd person, and we just see these 2 sit down and start talking. So that's Roman numeral 1. In Roman numeral 2, the next quick change is Yusuf the factotum. And of course, a factotum is a guy who does a bunch of different jobs. Yusuf the factotum, who then at a hotel, at a party at the Austrian consulate, and this is still in Alexandria as it opens up, sees Porpentine and Goodfellow, and them also together with Victoria Wren, her sister Mildred, and the father Alistair Wren, and Yusuf's various contemptuous thoughts about them. And that's quick change number 2. Quick change number 3 then is told from the point of view, it takes place in a restaurant, and it's told from the point of view of a pedophile named Maxwell Rowley Boog, who's a pedophile who's been chased out of Europe, Ireland, I believe, has tried to change his name and his identity, and he's a thing for little girls, and he, of course, spots Mildred, the 11-year-old Mildred, right away. So he migrates over to their table, Porpentine and Goodfellow, and Victoria Wren and her sister. He sort of slithers his way over, and then at a certain point, they're talking, and they're eating, laughing, and carousing, and then Bongo Shaftesbury sits down. And this guy immediately notices the tension between Bongo Shaftesbury and Porpentine, and he begins to realize these people aren't who they say they are. They're pretending to be tourists, but he can tell something else is going on by certain glances, certain things that are not said, certain things that are said. This guy's a professional fraud himself. He's pretending to be a tourist, so he realizes something is up. And then Lepsius comes over and sits down. Lepsius is always wearing a pair of spectacles with blue lenses. It's another mnemonic device that Pynchon uses to identify him. So then they wander away, and they get rid of this guy, Maxwell, the pedophile. They don't know anything about him, of course. They just give him they give him £5, and he leaves. And then we have quick change number 4, which takes place on a train, the Alexandria to Cairo Express. Recall that Cecil Rhodes had wanted to build a transcontinental train from Cairo all the way down to Cape Town. And so this is told from the point of view of a Portuguese Jewish man named Waldatar, who is a train conductor. And he's on the train, and he's listening in at the doors, and he opens one door, and he sees in there Bongo Shaftesbury and Mildred and Victoria and Porpentine. And then he overhears this conversation where Bongo Shaftesbury is trying to scare Mildred, and what he does is he says, you know anything about mechanical dolls? You should have a doll that has wind-up parts, that does everything that you want it to do. And he says, look at me, for instance. I'm actually a robot. I'm a mechanical doll, too. And he rolls up his sleeve, and he has a little switch, an electrical switch, that has been sewn into the flesh of his arm with a switch on it, and then some diodes that go all the way up his sleeve. And he says, now, the mode that it's in right now corresponds to the mood that I'm in. But if I want to change my mood, all I do is flip the switch. It's a little bit like a forerunner of the pharmaceutical industry, the psychopharmaceutical industry, where you can take these neato chemicals, pills that are switches in your brain to help deal with things like bipolarity and stuff like that. But it scares Mildred, and it causes an intense visceral reaction on the part of Porpentine, who says, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. He's actually the most humane of these 4 spies. He's like, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. He's the only one who ever exhibits any kind of compassion. So that's it for that scene. And then there's quick change number 5, which is from the point of view of Gabriel, who is a coachman. So he's ferrying people around town in a coach pulled by horses, but he used to be a farmer, but now they're in Cairo, and he lost his farm to the desert. The desert gradually encroached, so he's very bitter about his life. He's lost his farm, and now he's been reduced to the status of a coachman. And he knows about the Fasciota Crisis, and all you can hear is that Kitchener is going to meet with Marchand at Fasciota. Fasciota. Everyone's talking about it, and he starts having these apocalyptic associations that it might be start off a war that will be the beginnings of the end of the world. And in Islamic tradition, even though he's named after Gabriel, in the Christian tradition, who blows the horn to announce the kickoff of the apocalypse at the end of time, In Islamic tradition, it's a character named, an angel named Asrafil, which is Raphael. It's a transformation of Raphael. And he is the one who blows the horn at the end of time. And he's thinking about this in his head and his own name, and he knows what the traditions are. That's a kind of an interesting foreshadowing, too, of the horn that is the symbol of the Tristero in The Crying of Lot 49, the novel that comes right after this. You can already see Pynchon working the seeds of ideas that later become novels, already foreshadowing, casting their shadows backwards in time in his earlier works. He had also earlier in this book mentioned White Sands and the rockets developed there. So he's ferrying around Goodfellow and Porpentine, and he overhears some of their chatter and realizes that they must be involved in politics somehow. And so then comes quick change number 6, which is now from the point of view of Girgis the burglar. So he's a cat burglar. He makes his living in the daytime by being a clown to entertain kids. And then at night, he climbs up on window ledges on hotels, specifically to rob tourists. And as he's on this ledge one night, he sees, oh, there's competition. Another guy comes out, it's Porpentine, who comes out, and he's looking in at his own hotel room window to see Goodfellow in there having sex with Victoria Wren in his room, the bed that he's renting. And he's furious about it, and he falls. Porpentine is a klutz. He's fallen before. He fell at the party at the Austrian consulate. He fell down the stairs, and everybody laughed at him. So he's a klutz. He falls again, and then he climbs up a tree to try to get a different view, falls out of the tree, and the cat burglar guy gets down, and it's dark out, and there's no, there are no stars out on this particular night. There's clouds or whatever, and he thinks it's Bungo Shaftesbury. Porpentine does, and he's like, I know you, believe me, you won't get me. I know who you are. Trust me. And then so I think the final quick change then is Roman numeral 7, which is set in a German bar, a bar that Germans have made in Cairo, from the point of view of a barmaid named Hannah. And so we're right back to the bar that we opened the novel with in chapter 1, the same kind of environments with barmaids, and which I had said there, I'd compared with the Scandinavian tavern at which Gertrude serves the ale of immortality to all the dead heroes. And here, this woman Hannah then, at one point, she overhears an interesting conversation, but at one point, as she's doing the dishes, there's this interesting paragraph where she sees on one of the dishes, it looks like there's a triangle. And she looks at it, and it looks like, oh, there's a stain, a triangular stain on this dish. The triangle is always associated with V, of course. The cubic triangle, the vaginal symbol. And she's looking at it, and she tilts it from different angles, and it seems to change its shape. So she's not really sure whether it's a triangle, or indeed whether it's really even there. And in one paragraph, that's of course the whole theme of the postmodern aspect of this novel, that we can never be sure about truth. We can never be sure that with grand metaphysical narratives that they are true, and that we really are getting the truth. Maybe we are just projecting shapes that really aren't there. But she's not sure, and she thinks the triangle might really be there. And indeed, so in some of these narratives, there may be truth in them, which I'm 100% certain that there is. And then she's walking out, and she overhears bits and pieces of conversation that Porpentine is having with another individual, and I'm not sure who it is. It's not Goodfellow, and it obviously can't be Lepsius. But he has overheard that most likely Bungo Shaftesbury is going to attempt to assassinate the British consul general, who is in Egypt, Lord Cromer, at an opera. And Porpentine is pretty sure this is what Bungo Shaftesbury is going to do. And then so indeed in the final scene, which is told objectively in third person without a quick change, actually, subsection 8, we're at the opera, and Lepsius is sitting in one box over. This is the opera Men in Lascaux, sitting one box over, and then Goodfellow, Victoria Wren, and Porpentine all enter into the adjacent box. Then Victoria comes out crying. and then Goodfellow follows after her. So obviously there's been a breakup, just like at the end of Godfather Part 3, where the relationship between the Andy Garcia character and a couple of his daughters, Sophia, ends at the opera house, and she comes out crying. A very similar scene. I don't know if Coppola has read this or not. Likely that he probably has. Actually, he's very literate. And then then there's a shot, and obviously Bongo Shaftesbury shows up and attempts to shoot Lord Cromer, but misses. And then Porpentine gets into a struggle with Lepsius in the box next door, rips off his glasses, and then stands up, and then Bongo Shaftesbury then puts 3 bullets into him and kills him. And now keep in mind, that's the end of the chapter, but keep in mind now that Herbert Stencil, his father Sidney knew some of these people. I think he knew Bongo Shaftesbury because he's staying in Bongo Shaftesbury's son's Eric's apartment, Eric Bongo Shaftesbury, and that's the apartment in New York that he's actually renting. And Eric Bongo Shaftesbury has become an Egyptologist who is out, and I guess somehow Stencil has gotten in as an apartment sitter for him temporarily. So that's where, I believe, where he's writing this out. And so that's the first V episode, and chapter 3. And then so chapter 4, we get to Esther's nose job. That'll be next, which is one of the funniest chapters, I think, that Pynchon ever wrote.